everyone, I'm Stefan Krutzkowski. I've been asked to help you with some building for a healthy life training, and one of the exercises you've been tasked to do is to do a building for a healthy life audit of a completed development. Now you can choose your own development, or you can pop along to Barton Park in Barton, Seagrave. If you can't get out on site, then you can use this video that we've prepared, and you'll have enough information here to enable you to draw a conclusion on the 10 building for a healthy life considerations you've been asked to look at. So they are numbers 1 and 2 and 5 through to 12. So there's always a temptation when you're doing a building for a healthy life audit to have a look at the planning application, print off a plan, read the design and access statement. But I'd encourage you to resist that temptation and not do that. Obviously you want to get a plan to understand your site in terms of its location, but beyond that, the best thing to do is to just take a walk around the development and record what you see. Take a walk around, take some photos, and have the 10 considerations in mind and look for evidence that supports your conclusions. So the conclusions you've been asked to reach are whether the development you've chosen achieves a red, green or amber light against each of the building for a healthy life considerations. So green means a scheme resolves the requirements of a consideration well, amber means it resolves it well in some places, less so in others, and red means there are fundamental weaknesses with the scheme and it needs a redesign to meet the requirements of that consideration. So through this video I'm going to be walking you around, taking you around, and I'm going to be pointing out the things I notice, and hopefully these will help you in your own audits. If you look over my shoulder you can see a small bit of open space, that bit of grass with a tree looking slightly sorry for itself. Think about consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. How could you design that differently? Consideration number 2, walking, cycling, public transport. It's about making sure you've got pedestrian connections that stitch a development into its wider neighbourhood. So you've got a really neat little connection here, and if you just pan over to the other side you can see you've got a property here which is offering surveillance opportunities, which is really good to make sure you design out opportunities for crime and social behaviour. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. Think about what you're going to see at the end of the street. Here the vista at the end of the street is terminated by a blank wall. We can do much better. We can frame the view at the end of the street with landscape features, whether that's park or open space, or the principal facade of a building. The other thing to notice here, thinking back to consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home, is we've got this strip of grass which isn't really serving any public or private function. Consideration 8, easy to find your way around. One of the best things you can do on larger developments is to make sure that streets are meaningfully different from one another. So we're going to look at some of the other streets, but here you've got a news type street which looks very different from some of the principal streets on the development that are tree lined. So streets can be a really good way to help people navigate their way around larger developments. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. Top end of the street you've got buildings addressing the end of that vista, which is a good way to terminate a view down the end of the street. If you pan round, you'll notice we've maybe not got it right down at the bottom, and I'm tempted to turn that building round, or at least give it a stronger secondary elevation. There's a few things we can notice around this particular space here. So consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. You can see behind me we've got a building that offers a blank gable end to the street and quite a substantial wall as well. And we've also got this strip of landscaping to the front that doesn't really look well cared for. So think about consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. The other thing we can notice here, if we just pan over here, you can see this tree that was obviously here before the site was developed. In consideration 5, it talks about making the most of what's there. So it's really important that we not only keep existing trees but make the best of them. And this space has done that particularly well by using this as a bit of an opportunity space and creating a bit of a focal point space. Panning the background to this building that offers the blank gable end to the street, they've really missed an opportunity here to make the best of this tree and have some windows that not only overlook the street and address the street, but make sure people that live within this home benefit from some nice views of this tree. There are a few things I want to point out here. So we've just come from that open space where we've got that tree and we talked about that blank elevation. There's a few things I can point out to you here along this particular street. I'm going to try and remember them all. So consideration 2 talks about walking, cycling, public transport. So one of the best things we can do is to create connected street patterns and movement networks. What often happens on new developments is the edges of a development are downgraded to private drives. So private drives are privately conveyed to individual households. There's no rights of access for people who don't live off those private drives. But here, what we've got at this development is we've got adopted edge lanes. And that means that people who live here or live elsewhere on the development or live beyond the development can use these streets. And that has a direct implication on the amount people walk and how easy is it for them to walk and also cycle around new developments. If you also think about Building for Life consideration 8, easy to find your way around, we previously talked about different streets with different characters. So here we've got a street almost at the lower end of the spectrum, so this is an edge lane. You can see how it's been designed to have a slightly more informal feel, and it's in direct contrast to maybe the higher order streets which are tree lined and tend to be straighter. The other thing you can notice here is you've got car parking generally well integrated, and there's always been a temptation, particularly over the last 20 years, to tuck parking away out of sight, tuck it down the side of dwellings or put them into rear parking courts. But it's really important not to be afraid of frontage parking. As long as you've got landscaping at the front of the plot, you can actually integrate parking quite well. And you can see here how the landscaping is starting to take effect, starting to mature, and it starts to integrate parking into the street quite well. The other thing I should mention, which I almost forgot, was consideration number 10, which is about healthy streets. And part of that is designing streets to encourage low vehicle speeds. If we encourage low vehicle speeds, we also encourage people to walk and cycle more. And streets can also be used as social spaces, play spaces. And I think you can see from here that, a driver would be encouraged by the visual cues and the width of the carriageway here to adopt a slower, more cautious driving style. Consideration 2, walking, cycling, public transport. Think about walking. It's really important to anticipate desire lines, which is sometimes quite tricky to do. But I think a really good way to do this is when you're looking at a layout plan, almost do the dog walking test. Imagine you've got a dog, if you haven't got one, and think about the routes you might want to walk along. So here we've missed one, so you can just walk along here. Just a moment ago we saw somebody with a dog and they were walking along here, and you can actually see we've got a bit of a beaten track across this open space. So people are wanting to do this loop, and then that connects around the back here. So you can see, if you pan around here, you can see that people are walking down this edge lane, coming across here, and then they're obviously wanting to go down there. So a bit of a missing connection here. We've picked up on this property before, this one with the blank gable end and the blank wall, addressing this open space with this tree in the middle. And I think we've really missed an opportunity here to completely frame and finish off this space. All the homes around here you can see are offering their principal elevation to this space, and it helps to really enclose and define it. Bit of a missed opportunity with this building here, and obviously a great missed opportunity with the way the house at the end addresses this open space. Perhaps not the best place to put the substation either. Perhaps we could have done that differently. Yeah. What's really good here at Barton Park is you've got loads of walking routes. So you've got a really well connected streets and movement network. So you've got a really strong network of adopted streets, particularly along the edges of the development. But then you've got lots of pathway connections connecting parts of the development to other parts of the development, but also to the wider neighbourhood. So we've got a really neat little connection here. We're going to have a wander down here. We're in one of the open spaces here at Barton Park, so a few considerations here we can look at. So here we've got part of the surface water management scheme for the site, so consideration 11, green and blue infrastructure. And I think what's really neat here, it actually feels like a natural pond that you can go up to. You can feed the ducks. You haven't, excellent, you haven't got what you often see on new residential developments, which is a very steep-sided pond, fencing around the edge, and very engineered head walls, inlets and outlets. I'm back in this open space talking again. We just pan over here beyond the Canada geese. You can see how the homes are directed to face onto this open space, so that improves natural surveillance opportunities. They're obviously taking advantage of the views of the open space and this pond that we've previously seen. So think about consideration 5, making the most of what's there. Think about consideration 11, green and blue infrastructure. Consideration 11, green and blue infrastructure, looks at not only the types of spaces we're creating, but how they're going to be maintained. And seems a bit of a fluke today, but huge amount of maintenance work going on. Also looks at the types of play facilities we're providing, and I think this is quite neatly done, the way they've done all the play equipment, neatly integrated, and actually looks quite a bit of fun. And you can also see how the homes are all overlooking this open space, which is always good from a natural surveillance perspective. We're now at the far end of the open space, and there's a few things I want to point out here. You can see down here you've got the path, and it threads along here and it goes in that direction, but also along here and up the bank as well. So you've got a really good network of pedestrian routes through the development. I think the way they've integrated surface water management is really neat. I previously mentioned that the houses overlook the public open space, which is a really good thing to do. But you can just see right at the top of this staircase we've got a property here that isn't quite right. Whenever you've got a building on a street corner or is facing two parts of the public realm, it needs to be dual aspect. And I think here, actually the property needed to offer its primary elevation here and offer a secondary one on the other side. But either way, it needed to be a dual aspect property. Okay. We're at the southern tip of Barton Park, and what I think is a really good feature of Barton Park is the way it connects into the wider neighbourhood. So if we pan round, we can see that we're in the slightly more established parts of the suburb. And we pan round back to me, and you can see you've got a really neat little pedestrian connection, and I think that's a really great feature. So we're just going to take a little wander down. Previously talked about not being afraid of using frontage parking as a parking solution. And if you just look down, perhaps zoom in a bit, you can see how hedges are being used as a frontage boundary treatment, and that can be a really good way of helping to successfully integrate car parking into the street. We're at the junction of Denford Drive and Manor Road. A few things I want to point out here. If you look down here, we can see a street of a particular character. You can see how the parking solution relies very much on frontage parking, but the way that structural landscaping and fallen trees and hedges has been used to successfully integrate parking into the street. So you've got a change of surface materials which are designed particularly along with the cobbles to try and encourage drivers to adopt a slower and more cautious driving style. We've also talked about the importance of making sure that where buildings sit on a street corner, they offer a positive relationship with the streets and the public spaces around them. So here you can see you've got a house that offers two elevations. So it offers an elevation to the streets and public spaces around it. If we were to pan round, we've got a complete contrast with the building on the end here. And that's an example of where you do need a dual aspect building. Now, if you had a building that was perhaps L-shape in plan, or even like the one we've just looked at behind us, not only would you have a better relationship with the street, but the developer in this instance wouldn't have needed to spend such a large amount of money on a boundary wall, because the building would have formed that boundary enclosure. Just going to point out a private drive here to my side. Private drives can work, but you've got to make sure that they don't compromise pedestrian cycle movement. Here it's only serving a small amount of properties to make the best of this piece of land, and there's nothing wrong with this. The problem with private drives is when they're used along the edges of the development and they completely frustrate pedestrian and cycle movement. Connected street patterns are really important to create connected movement networks, and that's really neat here at Barton Park. You've not only got a series of street connections that help to stitch it into the wider neighbourhood, but you've got those footpath connections, and if you've not already seen them on the video, you're going to see them later on. These neat little pedestrian and cycle connections that make it a more walkable and cyclable place. The other building for health and life consideration is about creating developments that are easy to find your way around. One of the best ways we can do this on larger developments is thinking about how streets are meaningfully different to one another. So we're going to take a little rundown here in a second, but before we do, we're just going to pan round, and you can see one of the streets we've got here at Barton Park. And what makes this feel like a different street is the fact you've got a different treatment within the street. You've got a single-sided avenue, so you've got a 2.5 metre verge with the trees down one side. So this is a very different street to the one we're going to nip down here. So we're just going to take a little run down here. We've seen this street before, but you can see that this street is completely different. You don't have a tree-lined avenue, and you've got different surface materials. So the tree-lined one is very different to this street. That's higher order, this is lower order. And that can be a really effective tool in creating places that are easy to find your way around. It's often much better to do this with volume house builders. You know, you can really get them to think about how streets are meaningfully different to one another by using structural landscaping. What's really interesting about both streets is that you see the same house types on both streets. And all too often you can create a rod for your own back if you try and encourage developers to make elevational changes to buildings to make streets different to one another. Much better to do it with structural landscaping. A few things we can point out here. We've just come off the tree-lined street, and if you pan round here, you've got a street of a different character. So the building for life considerations you might want to be thinking about here are number 10, healthy streets and easy to find your way around. But the other thing you want to be thinking about here is how well a development provides connected street and movement networks. And you can see here that you've got a really neat connection through to the open space that runs along the western side of the development. A few things we want to point out here. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. Think about buildings that sit on street corners and need to be offering a face to more than one street or public open space, but you can compare it to this one that is offering at least a secondary elevation to the street. The other thing you can notice here is you've got pedestrian connection here. This is where you need to be thinking about walking, cycling and public transport, so that's consideration number 2. Consideration 10, cycle and car parking. If you're going to be using frontage car parking solutions, the trick is to make sure you use landscaping to settle car parking into the street environment. just behind me you can see that they've done this relatively well. What they've done is for every 3 spaces or so, they've assigned the space equal to the size of a parking space to some really chunky landscaping, and that really helps to settle parking into the street environment. Hopefully you can hear me over the strimmer that's going on in the background. But we've talked about private drives. So behind me you can see you've got a private drive that serves 2 or 3 properties just in that corner. Now, one of the risks with private drives is you create internal disconnects within the development, and you frustrate the ease at which people can move around a place, particularly on foot and by bike. But what's really good here is that you can see that there's almost like a compacted gravel surface. So whilst to the left you've got a private drive, you've got a path to the right hand side which is open to everyone. So you've safeguarded pedestrian and cycle movement. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. One of the things we're looking for is perimeter block structure. And that's where you have a block of development where the faces of homes face out of the streets and public spaces, and then the inner core is a series of interlocking back gardens. If you look at the plan of Barton Park, you'll notice that perimeter block structure is completed, where the development has an interface with existing back gardens that were here before the development was constructed. So you've got the completion of perimeter block structure on the eastern side of the development, and when we get to the western side of the development overlooking the public open space, which is just beyond me, if we just pan around and have a look, and if we continue panning around, you'll see that homes face out onto that open space. So not only are these homes making the most of what's here, so that's consideration number 5, but we're having that vital perimeter block structure, which is that consideration 7 I talked about. If you have fragmented perimeter block structure, this would be a series of back garden fences or maybe walls, and that would be a sign of fragmented perimeter block structure. But the other thing you've also got here is you've got an adopted street. So you've got an adopted street which helps people get around easily on foot and by bike. So that's a really good feature. So think about consideration number 2. And the other thing you might want to think about here is consideration 8, easy to find your way around. And one of the questions to ask yourself is, does this street feel different? Is this part of a network of streets that have different characters? If we do that on larger developments, we're more likely to create a place that's easier to find their way around. Consideration number 5, making the most of what's there. You can see we've got quite a few mature trees here at Barton Park, and they've been integrated into the development to create some focal point and memorable spaces. The other things we might want to think about here is walking, cycling, public transport. So have we got a series of connected routes to create a connected movement network for people to walk and cycle more, particularly for short trips? And the other thing we might want to be thinking about is, are we seeing any indicators that the principles of manual for streets have been incorporated into the development? So think about the user hierarchy in manual for streets, which says that pedestrians and cyclists must be at the top of the user hierarchy. The other thing we should be doing is making sure that streets are designed to encourage a driving speed of 20 mile per hour or less. So think about the design of that street and think about whether that's consistent with manual for streets. It's at the edges of development where connectivity is often frustrated, and that often happens because we use private drives. Now, private drives are conveyed to individual properties, and that means they're only open to people who live on that private drive, so there are no rights of public access. So if we look across here, we've got a private drive, and where those people are walking, that's the adoptable highway, but they're approaching the private drive. Now that means in theory we're not meant to be going across there, and that's really frustrating where we want to walk. Obviously we're not going to go that way, but you can see that people are walking along those routes, and it's a sign that that's where we need either an adopted street or a pedestrian path running parallel to the private drive. Obviously I've been really good and I've gone the long way around, but you can see here, you can zoom in on that side, so this is a private drive and you can see a couple walking the distance. Now you've got a key disconnect here. You can see the gravel path that's open to everyone, and I'm stood on the public street, so I'm stood on the adoptable highway. So we've got a little disconnect here of it's about 20 metres. Now I'm not saying this should be an adopted street, but what we should have done here is to create a pedestrian path to connect a key disconnect within the development. The other really interesting thing here is there's a cat stuck on the garage roof. Yep. We've just previously talked about this disconnect here. Now we're stood on Sanctuary Drive, and if we just pan round, we can see that that disconnect continues, and that's really unfortunate, because what Barton Park does really quite well is it creates a connected street and movement network, but it breaks down on this part of the development. I think that's a bit of a shame. So think about walking, cycling, public transport consideration number 2. Right, we're still on Sanctuary Drive, and I've been stood here for a few minutes now, having a look at this and thinking about what's not quite right here. So there's quite a few things going on. Obviously they've designed it to try and feel a bit more like a muse environment, to try and slow vehicle speeds and reinforce that street hierarchy, but you can also notice that some of the landscaping is looking slightly sorry for itself. So you need to be thinking about the requirements of consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. But if we look at the street, it's lacking something, and the key thing it's lacking is homes that actually face onto the street. So we've got signs of a slightly fragmented perimeter block structure here. So that's why you need to be thinking about the requirements of consideration number 7, well-defined streets and spaces. So we're at the top end of Sanctuary Drive. It looks much better from this angle, but what I've been noticing is a lot of people are walking down Sanctuary Drive and they're actually taking a shortcut over the private drive at the bottom we highlighted. So it just shows that we've got to be really careful when we look at developments and anticipate desire lines. You know, we've got to think about where people might want to walk to, and either provide streets at those locations, or if we can't provide streets for whatever reason, we've got to plug those gaps with paths that people can walk or cycle along. You can see that the landscaping along here isn't particularly working quite well, so think about consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. This is a different type of street here at Barton Park. This is a 2-sided tree-lined avenue, so you might want to be thinking about consideration 8, easy to find your way around. The other thing I'm going to also point out is this junction detail. If we can pan back, you might be able to see this, but you can see how the pavement actually crosses what might ordinarily be the carriageway. So if you think about Manual for Streets, which talks about a user hierarchy where pedestrians are at the top of the user hierarchy and then vehicles are much lower down the user hierarchy, this is sending a very clear message that pedestrians have got priority over vehicles. So this is pedestrian priority across a side junction. So think about consideration number 10, healthy streets. You might also want to think about consideration 2, walking, cycling. Okay. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. If we just pan over, we're going to see 2 buildings here that perhaps don't wrap the street corner as well as they might. So what could you do differently here? Consideration 10, cycling car parking. We can see that we've got some signs of displaced and antisocial parking, most probably as a result of tandem parking arrangements. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. I've mentioned this a few times, but if you've got buildings that are sat on a street corner or facing a street in a public open space, they need to be offering two elevations, so two principal elevations. They're often called dual aspect houses. So it's a really good idea to ask house builders what dual aspect houses they've got. So you can see here behind me we've got a building that should be dual aspect but isn't. Consideration 5, making the most of what's there. So along the western edge of Barton Park we've got the pond down the bottom. We've then got open countryside fields and some elements of woodland. If we pan round, you can see the interface between homes on Park View and some peripheral landscaping. But I just want to point out property just over my left shoulder. You can see it with the gable ends, but you can see the side elevation is largely blank, and I think they've perhaps missed a trick here, and perhaps you needed a dual aspect home. So I'm stood now on Park View, and it's a street that runs along the northwestern side of the development. We're going to have a little wander down. What I'd like you to think about is consideration number 10, healthy streets. So we've talked about healthy streets before. So who's at the top of the user hierarchy? Is it pedestrians and cyclists, or is it vehicles? When you go around a development, a good way to test this is to actually see where you walk. Now, if you tend to amble down the middle of the carriageway, the chances are it's been designed with pedestrians and cyclists in mind. The other thing that's really good about Park View is it provides a continuous connected edge. So think about connectivity. The other thing you want to be thinking about is well-defined streets and spaces, because we've got an outward facing perimeter block. So we're ticking a lot of boxes here. So we're ticking boxes around walking, cycling. We're ticking boxes of making the most of what's there because we're facing onto the woodlands. We've got a connected network, we've got perimeter block structure, and we're also ticking considerations within healthy streets. I forgot to mention something, consideration number 10, cycling car parking. What works really well here is that you've got frontage landscape in the form of hedges and trees, and they help to integrate frontage car parking. So don't be afraid of frontage car parking. What you need to make sure is you've got a balance of landscaping and driveway space, and if you get that right, you can integrate frontage parking really well. The other thing you'll notice here is that you've got vertical demarcations between public and private space, so you need to think about consideration number 12, back of pavement, front of home. Consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. You can see behind me you've got a building that's offering a dual elevation, so it sits on a street corner and it needs to do something on two sides, and that's what it does here. The other really nice aspect of Barton Park is you've got the allotments, and they've been really nicely integrated into the development. And if we pan around, you can see you've got the connected street network, so it's really easy to walk and cycle around here. We're just at the northern end of Park View, so we'll just come off the street, and if we pan round, you can see you've got a connection across to the west of the site, and you've got a connection going up to the north, and this is perhaps why you see so many people walking around Barton Park. You might recognise this part of Barton Park from the PowerPoint presentation I delivered a few weeks ago. We're stood between Park Road and Nicholas Road, and you've got a really nice little pedestrian connection here. It's got really good levels of natural surveillance opportunity, so you can see how buildings overlook the space, but you've also got some really sort of other neat features you need to be thinking about when thinking about the building for a healthy life consideration. So you can look at the boundary treatments and the way threshold space is resolved, so you need to be thinking about consideration number 12, back of pavement, front of home. The other thing Building for a Healthy Life encourages you to think about is to make sure it's really clear what's public and what's private. And we've talked about private drives as we've been going around here, and saying that if you use private drives, make sure they don't frustrate pedestrian cycle movement. So here we can see we've got a black tarmac route that provides that vital pedestrian cycle route. So think about how pedestrian cycle movement would be frustrated if this connection wasn't here. And this runs parallel to a private drive, so you can see the private drive is block paved, so it's very clear what's public and what's private. A good pedestrian cycle connection here off Nicholas Road, leading north to the allotments adjacent to the development, and you'll also notice that homes front onto this pedestrian cycle connection, and make sure you've got good levels of natural surveillance. We're on Mowbray Place, which is just off Nicholas Road. Street signs haven't gone up yet. A few things I want to point out here. So if we look down the street, you can see that the end of the street is finished off by some car parking spaces and garaging, which isn't always the best. If we pan round, we can see what's happening on the opposite side. It's always much better if you terminate a vista with a view of an open space or the principal elevation of a building. The other thing I'm just going to point out, you can see that you've got potentially some issues with waste storage, and it's something you also notice just down here with the terrace properties we've got. So there seems to be some issues with waste storage for terrace and semi-detached properties here. One of the best things about this part of the development, I think though, is the way that frontage parking's been integrated. Frontage parking normally really gets quite tricky when you're trying to integrate the parking for terrace and semi-detached properties. But what they've done here, which is quite clever, is not only have they provided a decent sized space for a tree, so I always say and always recommend that if you're going to integrate frontage parking, you need at least a space given over to landscaping for every 4 parking spaces or so. And when you provide that landscape space, make sure it's equal in width and depth to a standard car parking space, because if you just provide a tiny sliver of land, the chances are whatever landscaping you put in there isn't really going to thrive and flourish over the long term. However, on my right side, you can see that they've had a different tactic to using landscaping, and they've provided landscaping at the head or nose of the parking spaces, and that works really well, and this looks really quite attractive in summer. We've just crossed the street from Mowbray Place, and we're now having a look at Dale Crescent. And you might recall a few moments ago we were talking about how structural landscaping can be used to help integrate car parking to the street environment. So thinking about using a decent bulk of landscaping between car parking spaces at a ratio of maybe 1 to 4, or so perhaps 1 to 5. But it's really important to make sure that that landscaping is equal in width and depth to a car parking space, and that's really important because if you don't provide that level of space, that landscaping doesn't tend to flourish over time, and it also doesn't have the impact you need. And you can see that here on Dale Crescent, where you've got some landscaping, so you've got 2 trees, but they're only within those narrow 1 metre strips, and the chances are they're not going to flourish in the long term. But you can also see that they don't have the impact that landscaping has when you've got a much wider piece of landscaping. Just take a note of what's happening behind me, the way that junction detail's been designed. So if you think about healthy streets, which is linked back to manual for streets, it talks about pedestrians being at the top of the user hierarchy. And one of the tricks we can employ, or one of the techniques we can employ, is providing pedestrian priority across side junctions, so we're not breaking the pavement and that sends out a signal to drivers that pedestrians have got priority. Consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. A few signs that bin storage hasn't been resolved everywhere here. Consideration 10, cycling car parking. If you use rear parking courts, you've got to be really careful to make sure they benefit from really strong levels of natural surveillance opportunity, and that's not really provided here. So what you need to be looking for is that you've got properties within a courtyard, so at least one with ground floor habitable rooms to provide that natural surveillance opportunity. But if we just pan round, we can see a house at the entrance to the courtyard, so that's offering at least some natural surveillance opportunities here, but the one to my other side here isn't. The other thing you'll notice is that there isn't any lighting here, so imagine what this place is going to be like after dark. We're at the entrance to Barton Park on Polwell Lane, and a few things I want to point out here. So if we think about well-defined streets and spaces, you can see that the two properties at the entrance to the development perhaps don't wrap the corner as successfully as they might do. But the other main thing to notice is the design of the entrance junction. So you've got wide sweeping corner radii, and that has a direct implication on vehicle speeds. If you look at manual for streets, you can see a direct correlation between the design of corner radii, the speed of vehicles, and the ease at which pedestrians and cyclists can navigate junctions. This is the second car parking courtyard we're looking at, and when we looked at the first parking courtyard, we talked about the importance of lighting and natural surveillance opportunities, and we can see that we've got fewer natural surveillance opportunities here than we did with the first courtyard. So if we pan round, we can see that there are no natural surveillance opportunities provided by neighbouring properties, so you've really got very limited natural surveillance opportunities. But the other things we'll notice in this space are we've got waste storage issues. So has the waste storage been well resolved? So we want to be thinking about consideration number 12, back of pavement, front of home, and we've got this bit of open space here. So what function does that serve? Is it public, private, but also what's the purpose of it? Consideration 11, green and blue infrastructure, and consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. So we'll just have a look around. How well do we think the open spaces have been finished? Is it clear what's public and private? How are those threshold spaces defined, and how well they resolved? The other thing we'll notice here is we've got a large blank end to a house, so you need to be thinking about consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. Consideration 2, walking and cycling. A really good way to determine whether a scheme performs well in this regard is actually just observe what's going on. Are you seeing a lot of people walking and cycling around a development? The chances are you'll see more people walking and cycling if the street environment is designed to be attractive and friendly to pedestrians and cyclists, and you've got a network of connections. So that's what you'll notice at Barton Park, is you've got a huge amount of pedestrian and cycle connections, which creates a connected movement network. Consideration 12 is back of pavement, front of home, and we've got some apartments behind us here. Can we think of a better way of resolving the space between the edge of the footpath and the face of the apartment building here? I would think it's a really good idea to assign the ground floor apartments with their own sort of semi-private garden spaces here. So you could actually vertically demarcate that, perhaps with a hedge for this ground floor apartment here, and they could have a small patio. That's going to be really important, thinking about the potential impacts of living in a post-COVID world, giving people access to some outdoor space. for your exercise you're not looking at consideration number 3, which is facilities and services, but it would be amiss of me not to mention the fact that you've got community facilities on Barton Park, most notably the village hall. Handy little pedestrian cycle connection here between Barton Road and Powell Lane. We've seen some good solutions to integrating frontage parking here at Barton Park. So in some places it works really well, in some places it's less successful, and behind me you can see that you've got a long row of frontage car parking, and as soon as you start to do that, parking becomes quite a visually dominant feature within the street. What we needed here was at least one of those spaces given over to frontage landscaping. So if we'd got one of those spaces given over to frontage landscaping, you would have had a settling effect in the street, so the landscaping would have helped to integrate the frontage parking successfully. Consideration 12, back of pavement, front of home. Think about clearly demarcating spaces that are public and private, and make sure that you've got a robust boundary treatment in place. So where you get grass between the back of the pavement and the face of the building rarely works well. And the other thing you'll notice here is you've got a blank elevation to the street. So you want to be thinking about consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. Just called into Radnor Way, having just left Barton Park, and I've called in here because I wanted to point something out to you. A lot of people say it's sometimes really difficult to decide what's a red, what's an amber, and what's a green. And a lot of that comes with experience. So if you're thinking about consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces, this is what a red would look like, for instance. There are a number of ways of getting a red, but this is a one-way. So you can see behind me that you've got 3 homes all in a line, and the relationship between the buildings and the streets here is what we would say is completely negative. You don't have a positive relationship, and that's because buildings are turning away from the street, they're offering a blank elevation to the street, and you're getting garden boundaries forming the edge of the street. So this is a really good example of what a red might look like against consideration 7. Hi everyone, this is the 3rd take of this particular part of the video, so fingers crossed I'm going to get it right this time. I hope you found the virtual site visit useful. I normally take small groups out and we have a bit of a discussion as we're going round. Gives you the opportunity to ask me more questions and get further advice. So I've had to anticipate some of the questions and points you'll be asking for a bit more information on, but hopefully you found it useful. I just wanted to expand on a few of the Building for Healthy Life considerations and some of the things I maybe didn't point out on site to you. The first is the natural connections considerations. That's the first consideration in the Building for Healthy Life. What you're looking for there is evidence of connected street and movement networks. So were you seeing evidence that connected street patterns and movement networks were provided, and that connectivity wasn't frustrated along the edges of a development? So were those cycle and pedestrian design lines anticipated and responded to in the design? It might be useful for you to get a copy of the site plan for Barton Park for you to draw your conclusion on this. If you get those qualities right, the chances are you're going to set a strong foundation for the second Building for a Healthy Life consideration, which is walking, cycling and public transport. And I pointed out some good and bad aspects of the scheme to you when we were doing the site visit. I talked a lot about consideration number 5, making the most of what's there, so I'm not going to expand any further on that. But one consideration I really didn't talk about much on site was the consideration 6, which is a distinctive character. It's one of the considerations that people tend to struggle with most. And my advice really would be for you to maybe project your minds forward 5-10 years into the future. If somebody showed you this video again without telling you it was Barton Park, or they showed you a photo of Barton Park, do you think there's something in what you would see in terms of the streets and the public spaces that would allow you to think, that's Barton Park, I remember where that is? If that's the case, the chances are you're going to be looking at giving a green against this particular consideration. I talked a lot about consideration 7, well-defined streets and spaces. I also talked a bit about legibility, so consideration 8, a development that's easy to find your way around. One of the best ways a developer can create a place that is easy to find the way around is actually to create meaningful variation between streets and public spaces. So refer back to the video and see if you saw evidence of that. Consideration 9 was healthy streets, and I talked quite a bit about manual for streets and the user hierarchy that prioritises pedestrians and cyclists. So did you see evidence of that? If you saw some evidence of it, and then in some places you thought it was reverting back to a more sort of car-dominated user hierarchy, that's an example of where you might want to consider an amber light rather than a red or a green, for instance. Consideration 10 is cycle and car parking. Now, to be fair to Barton Park, it was designed under the previous edition of Building for Life, where cycle parking provision wasn't a major consideration. So for the purposes of the exercise, I would say it's mostly more fair or more robust in this instance, just to look at the car parking aspect of that consideration, because cycle parking under the new edition of Building for Life requires households to have access to one cycle that's as easy to access as a parked car on the driveway. And the final two considerations, 11 and 12, I talked a lot about on the video. So hopefully you'll enjoy this exercise. If you need any advice or you're getting stuck in any way, either drop myself an email at stefan@urbandesigndr.co.uk, or you can of course contact Natalie. See you all soon. Bye.